There's so much in Peter's talk as a physician that I could comment on. I want to make one footnote. I trained in general surgery at the City Hospital on the Harvard service when I was still there. And Max Finland, who was about this high, was one of the most brilliant people I think I ever met. He was really, and you get it lost in Peter's presentation because he is an authority on so many things, but he became really one of the fathers of infectious disease and actually discovered certain bacteria that we treat nowadays. He was a devotee of symphony and used to walk down the middle of Mass Ave when the South End wasn't exactly bucolic and got mugged several times, but he constantly walked down the middle of the street. He's really a character. Paul Christian has asked me to introduce two fire people who I think should be recognized and ask them to stand. Richard Paris, the president of the Boston Firefighters Local 718. Is he here? And then Ed Kelly, Secretary Treasurer of the International Association of Firefighters. And Mayor Flynn really is very right. We're blessed to have so many people that have contributed so much in this city. I mean, I'm a great champion of the city of Boston, but I must say, sometimes when you do one of these things, you really realize who your neighbors are. We're going to shift the program a little bit. We have, as I said, Dr. Burke spoke on behalf of the City Hospital, and my good friend and colleague in plastic surgery, Matt Donlan, who's the staff chairman there at the Shriners Burn Hospital for Children, is going to talk representing the Mass General wing. I talked yesterday, before Matt comes up here, I spent a half an hour on the phone, and the people on the committee will find this interesting, talking to John Heyman, who's now the oldest living survivor. He's 98, and his family is here, and I'm sure they'll introduce themselves at the end here. But he just didn't want to come today. And he's so verbal, and it's unbelievable. But he told me that he was admitted to the Boston City, and he ultimately went to the Mass General, was transferred there for care, and I think he was operated on by the great Dr. Kazanjian 6 times or so, and he's an amazing guy to talk to, John Heyman. So just that footnote. Matt?
So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ken, very much for inviting me to participate in this remarkable commemoration of the Coconut Grove fire. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be here today as a representative of the Shriners Hospital for Children, Boston. I am accompanied by our chairman of the board, Mr. Robert Baker, and by our administrator, Ms. Eileen Skinner. And we are all here to remember and commemorate those who either lost their lives or were permanently injured in this Coconut Grove fire. It is also an honor and a privilege to share and celebrate with you the amazing scientific, medical, surgical, public health, and mass casualty advances that resulted from this tragedy. Can we cue up my presentation here, please? Let me get this. Sorry, I'm a little unfamiliar with your computer's doodad here. That's me. Sweetness. Great, you got it. Okay, there we go. I'm working off of the. There we go. Okay. So one acknowledgement here. I would like to thank my 2 colleagues, Ken Marshall and also Dr. Thomas Davenport, who trained at the MGH and became an aficionado of the Coconut Grove fire. Both of them have shared their ideas, observations, and some of their images with me, which will help me to briefly tell this story and its impact on the current and future areas of burn care. So we've all talked about the fact that this was the top nightclub in Boston, and this was the worst nightclub fire in United States history. It ranks 5th in terms of mortality, in terms of single burn disasters. I don't know how the Titanic got in there, but there was fire on the ship as well at sea. We've listened to these numbers already. These are just for a reminder here. 300 patients arrived at Boston City Hospital. 168 were dead on arrival. 36 died within hours. They ended up with 96 living patients, and of those, 39 eventually died. So there was a mortality of 40% amongst that patient population. 114 patients were admitted to the Mass General Hospital, and 39 of those lived through the night. Of those 39 patients, 7 eventually died, but has already been mentioned by Dr. Burke. Pulmonary complications were very extensive during this fire, and they were quite a mystery to the treating physicians and surgeons at that time. We'll talk about that in a minute. Dr. Marshall has already mentioned the major advances as an aftermath of all of this, and the experts have already spoken from the fire and from the police departments. But just to list them, it's pretty impressive. Improved building code regulations, greatly increased public education and awareness, improved mass casualty planning, increased focus on burn-related science and treatment. Everybody got interested in this, and also the war was going on at that time, and fire was a major threat to the soldiers in the battlefield area. So the entire medical and surgical community got much more focused on burn care than they had been before. It also resulted through public safety in a greatly reduced incidence of major burn injuries in the United States and in the developed world. And this decreased mortality and morbidity from burn injuries overall. That's just what was referred to a moment ago. We don't know how much of an impact it has had, but in the burn business we do, because we can see how much less the incidence of major burns has become. We've already gone over with the experts the resulting changes in the building codes, so I won't renew that again. One interesting thing about all of these pictures to me is how it represents the chaos of the initial response to the injury. And you can see that in these pictures, all of the people who are in the area and those who came to help are doing their best to help, but there's a significant less presence than we see today in first responders, not only being there in large numbers, but also organizing the chaos. There's always going to be chaos, but I think we're much better at evacuation and crowd control now than we were at that time. This is an interesting statement. Between 1942 and 1952, there was a 50% mortality rate in children with burns covering 50% of their body surface area. That's important because otherwise they are 100% healthy. They're children. They're not elderly, obese diabetics with cardiac conditions. These are very healthy children. Now, at this time, burn care survival in children has improved so much that a greater than 95% body surface area burn can be survived 50% of the time. At our own Shriners Hospital here in Boston, we almost never have a child die unless they come 2 weeks or longer from a third world country. It's quite an incredible change. And so these are the 5 monumental changes that have taken place. Burns, increased understanding of the pathophysiology of smoke inhalation, the use of penicillin, the blood bank, and the use of plasma, and also the description of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's very interesting that Boston in 1942 was preparing for war. Pearl Harbor had just taken place. There were rumors of German U-boats that were outside of Boston Harbor. The Boston Navy Yard was a major war resource, and so the city was on alert, and just a month prior to the Coconut Grove fire, there actually was a major disaster drill in which all of the hospitals were mobilized and were thinking about this sort of stuff. And the plasma and other supplies were being stockpiled in Boston at that time. Looking at the burn progress, there are 3 major players that were at the Mass General Hospital. Charlie Lund, I think, from Boston City Hospital is a little underrepresented in the history. He made major contributions. But the thing that's amazing to me is we always see pictures of these doctors in the twilight of their career. They were incredibly young. Oliver Cope was 40, Brad Cannon was 35, and Dr. Francis Moore was 29 years old when they were doing all of these amazing things and then studying them. And partly that was because the National Research Council had asked people in hospitals to focus on burn care and understanding better ways to treat burns. So because of that, the dressing controversy that had raged for years about whether to use tannic acid as opposed to antibiotics topically and not pay as much attention, the wound was resolved. Pulmonary care led to us understanding acute respiratory distress syndrome, so-called ARDS, and it wasn't poison gas like World War I that was causing the problem. We understood, as was just explained clearly by Dr. Burke, the importance of adequate plasma fluid resuscitation. We had sort of an uncontrolled, controlled experiment with two different excellent hospitals using different resuscitation techniques. This was the first use of a blood bank and an early use of albumin. It was the first large-scale use of penicillin, although the levels of penicillin that were achieved were probably so low that they didn't have a significant impact, but it is an interesting historic point. And also, the psychiatrist listed below, Dr. Alexandra Adler, Stanley Cobb, and Eric Lindemann, first defined post-traumatic stress disorder. Interestingly enough, at the same time in 1942, the polio epidemic was raging. And as a result of that, the Shriners Hospitals had been built to provide these places with iron lungs to take care of children. And then when the polio epidemic was ended by Salk and Sabin in the late 50s and early 60s, all of a sudden the Shriners had all these hospitals that were filled with orthopedic equipment and they didn't need the iron lungs. So at that time, in the 50s, the Shriners were looking for something else to do. And what they chose to do was to focus on pediatric burns, which Oliver Cope pointed out to them was a vastly underserved and poorly understood area of healthcare. And so they decided in the 1950s to set up a Shriners Burns Institute. And this is a picture of the meeting of the first board in 1964 here in Boston. And the first hospital opened with Peter Burke's father as the chief of staff, Dr. John Burke. Interestingly enough, he by the way, he volunteered to join the military the day after Pearl Harbor, and he was an Army Air Force fighter pilot in Europe, I think, at the end of that war. But at any rate, he was a student of Oliver Cope and a surgical scientist like Dr. Francis Moore, and so he pursued the science that they had started. They created the first functional skin bank in 1971, and in 1981, Dr. Burke worked with Dr. Janas to create the first artificial organ that worked, and that would be artificial skin, an amazing scientific advance. And so, from the ashes of this Coconut Grove fire, I'll use the same image here, a phoenix has risen in the care of burn patients. And as the stats showed, patients such as this boy from the Dominican Republic now routinely survive 50% body surface area burns and can be restored to a near normal condition using the innumerable advances that were initiated by this tragic accident. And thank you very much for your attention.
I've known Matt for too long to admit. Great talk. We are happy to have the very important side of medical care represented by the nurses. As I indicated at my beginning, my connection, of course, to this was my own mother. And so Barbara Poremba is going to talk about the unsung heroes of the Coconut Grove and the work that they did to really save and protect lives. Barbara?
Okay, gotta change the and I'm gonna be that one right there. Oh, Coconut Grove. That's it. And started at the top. No, I need to start at the beginning of the show. That's the end. Scroll up. And then I need presenter. And I think that works perfectly. Good afternoon. I'm just wondering, first, before I start, how many nurses are here today? Yay! Let me begin and say, on that cold Saturday night in late November, 75 years ago, approximately 1,000 patrons had crowded into the Coconut Grove nightclub. 658, or 2/3, would be destined to be victims. Out of these, 472 would die, giving this disaster an alarming fatality rate of 50%, or with only 1 out of 2 surviving. Today, it remains our nation's deadliest nightclub fire and Boston's greatest disaster. There are many heroic stories being told here today. We will hear of victims and survivors and first responders, the police, the fire, and the military men. Their suffering and their sacrifices must not be forgotten. I am here today to acknowledge and remember the many contributions of the nurses of the Coconut Grove fire, the women who also acted as first responders and critical care nurses before such a role was defined. Their actions immediately and in the difficult days that followed are why there were survivors. They are the unsung heroines of the Coconut Grove fire. To add a little background, as we've heard, the United States had entered World War II less than a year before. In anticipation of multiple casualties, the city had held a civil defense drill just 1 week prior to this disaster. Hospitals were on high alert. They had disaster plans, and they had stockpiled supplies in the event of a mass incident. But because of the war and the great need of military nurses, there was a shortage of nurses in the home front. On the night of the fire, 114, or about 25% of the victims, were sent to Mass General Hospital, the highly regarded private hospital affiliated with Harvard Medical School. Anticipating needs, the director of nursing immediately ordered the 6th floor of the new white building to be cleared to create a special care ward for the victims. As the victims arrived, Mass General operationalized their very well-planned disaster response. 2 teams of doctors working in pairs triaged the victims, assigning them to specific locations in the hospital for various injuries and conditions. 75 victims were dead on arrival, and 39 patients were admitted, most to that special care unit on White 6. Because of its research and teaching focus, the treatment protocols of Mass General hospitals were unique and cutting edge. They initiated a quick response to respiratory injuries and implemented these new treatment modalities that they had been working on, such as the blood bank and frozen plasma for replacement and shock, the Vaseline gauze for burn care, and the first use of penicillin for infection. But the vast majority of the victims, 75%, had been immediately transported to Boston City Hospital, the city's largest hospital for the poor. This is Boston City Hospital around that time. Today it's very different and is part of Boston Medical Center. Over a period of 75 minutes, Boston City Hospital received and triaged 429 patients. 300 patients were dead on arrival or near death. 129 were admitted. This volume, averaging 1 patient every 11 seconds, exceeds the treatment rate encountered in London during the Blitz and is one of the highest admission rates ever recorded. Upon arrival to the accident room, the director of nurses, Miss Margaret Boucher, witnessed the bodies of the dead, the dying, and the frightfully burned as they streamed in, soon crowding the floor. The director of nurses quickly assessed the situation and immediately put a plan in place. Her actions alone saved many lives. Director of Nurses Boucher recounted saying to herself, "This is it. It was the kind of catastrophe, if of a different order, that we had been preparing all these months to meet." Knowing that the student nurses, most mere teenagers, were holding a dance in the nurses' house located on the hospital grounds, Nurse Boucher quickly corralled them from the dance and had them out of their party clothes and into their uniforms and action within minutes. Then she ordered all nurses leaving the 3 to 11 shifts to the accident department. That's what they called it then. A call was then put out for all off-duty nurses to report to the hospital, and they responded. This undoubtedly also saved lives. In order to immediately medicate patients who were not yet identified and processed, the director of nursing authorized that lipsticks from the nurses be gathered and used to mark a large M on the forehead of those who had received morphine. Beyond her leadership, the director of nurses also provided direct care. Miraculously, Ms. Boucher recalled, the lines of bodies kept moving, the corpses to the morgue, and the living to the swiftly prepared wards. At 2 a.m., Nurse Boucher, she looked at her blood-covered hands and said, "Not for 2 days," she sighed, "could I cleanse my hands of the smell of burnt flesh. I hope I never have to look at anything like Saturday night again as long as I live." The nurses assisted in carrying out all of the Boston City Hospital protocols. Unlike Mass General, for burns, Boston City Hospital used traditional practices such as IV fluids, debridement, and tannic, or triple gentian violet. Gentian violet was part of it, so many of the nurses called it gentian violet for for infection sulfa drugs. The nurses worked continuously throughout the night. Many stayed for the first few days with little rest. They carried on, putting aside their own personal grief to attend to the doctors they knew and respected, who had also been patrons that night at the Coconut Grove and were now dead or dying before them. One nurse continued to work after learning that her own brother had died in the fire. Others would later find out that they had family members who were victims. For their entire lives, they all carried with them vivid memories of this disaster. I want to tell you now very briefly some highlights of the stories of 3 heroic women of the Coconut Grove fire: Anne, Helen, and May. They were nurses at Boston City Hospital. The first is Anne Montgomery, then a 19-year-old nursing student. Anne is alive, and she has told me her story many times, each time with more clarity. She asked me to tell her story to you today. She was at the dance in the nurses' residence when over the intercom they had orders to go put on their uniforms and report to wherever they had been assigned that day. Anne was in orientation in the accident department, so there she went. She recounted, "The bodies were flowing in one by one. The doctors would listen, and so many were dead. They were flowing in faster than they could bring them over to the morgue across the street. Then they started to stockpile them in one of the rooms at the end of the corridor. They sent me to guard the bodies and make sure no one robs them of their valuables," they told me. I was only a kid, she said. I was scared, and I thought how sad. And to see all of these dead bodies, and then taking care of patients that I soon found out none of them had survived. She recalls when she was finally able to go home. I put on my coat and I wanted to escape, and I took the bus down the street to Hyde Park. I realized that, oh my God, everyone must smell all the burnt flesh. But no one said anything. But I thought, what have I gotten myself into? But I slept, and I went back the next day, and I went up to the wards, and I helped the nurses take care of burn patients. They gave them morphine. They were in a lot of pain. They didn't have penicillin, and they used gentian violets on the burns. There were long wards of about 20 patients on each side. Everything had to be sterile, masks and, well, instruments. We didn't use gloves. They didn't want a lot of visitors and had strict visitation. It was sad. Upon graduation, Anne entered the Army as a second lieutenant and served overseas. After the war, she returned to Boston City Hospital and became Assistant Deputy Commissioner of Boston Health and Hospitals. Then there's Helen Berman. She was a 21-year-old new graduate of Boston City Hospital. She also is alive and has asked me to tell you her story. She'd only been working at Boston City for 3 months while awaiting assignment in the Navy. She was working as night supervisor of the neuro OR, or as she would explain, I was the supervisor because I was the only nurse. That night, she was coming home on the streetcar from a date at the movies in Dorchester. When she got home, she found her parents frantic. "Where were you? We're so worried. Didn't you know what happened? They're calling all nurses." So I called and I went. I took a taxi. At that point, the war was going on. There was no lights at night, and nobody could go any place in the night because the police would stop you. Everyone thought that we were going to be bombed. When I got there, they sent me up to the neuro OR. I was to get bandages and IVs. Brought them down, and I put the bandages on one end of the ward and the IVs on the other. Everything was happening so fast that you just couldn't think. You just did what you were told. I started taking blood pressures, and I came upon this man who didn't know what was going on. He was agitated. "What kind of a hospital is this? I can't even get a drink." I said, "Don't you know what happened? We had a great fire." He calmed down. The Red Cross was there. They called his parents, and they came and got him. I found out later he was in the orchestra. Then someone pulled me to do bandages, and then IVs. We just worked incessantly. We didn't know where we were going. We just kept going all night until about 9 a.m. I was so exhausted, and we went home and slept and came back the next night and did this for days. I took care of some doctors I knew who were at the Coconut Grove, and they died. I found out later that I had a first cousin who had died and other people we knew. But there was no time to think. You just went from one thing to another. You just kept going. You didn't think. You just did. 3 months later, she was a military nurse. Today, she's a proud veteran, first lieutenant in the Navy. And lastly, Nurse May, Mary Elizabeth Cray, Boston City Hospital, 34. Nurse May was an Irish immigrant and a former national river dance champion. At that time, she was married and had a 4-year-old son, Ken Marshall, who many of you know as president of the Coconut Grove Memorial Committee. Nurse May was working in the South Department of Boston City Hospital on the night of the Coconut Grove and did not return home for 4 days after the fire. Ken remembers this because his father had to close the pharmacy in order to take care of him. Nurse May was one of 5 nurses who cared for Coast Guardsman Clifford Johnson. He was the most severely burned victim to survive as he ran back into the Coconut Grove to rescue others. He survived from burns over 55% of his body, including full-thickness burns down to the bone. He required 24-hour skilled nursing and was hospitalized for nearly 2 years. This is a photo of him finally walking for his first time after nearly a year. But he did recover, and he married one of the nurses, Marion Donovan, and moved back to Missouri. Ironically, 14 years later, in 1956, he was in a tragic pickup accident where he died from his burns. For many years, Nurse May suffered nightmares, screaming out as she relived seeing the bodies of men and women who were in the prime of their lives, lined up in rows, all dressed up to the nines in their very fancy evening dresses and formal tuxedos, with no visible external cause of death. We now know that these victims had died from respiratory failure due to inhalation of hot, toxic fumes, and that Nurse May and many others suffered from what we now know is PTSD. Many lessons were learned because of the Coconut Grove fire, such as burn care, shock, PTSD, and disaster response. But it was because of the compassionate care given by skilled nurses that these treatments were successful in the survival of the victims. In fact, because of their expertise in treating burn patients from the Coconut Grove, less than 2 years later, Mass General Hospital sent nurses to assist in the care of burn victims at the Hartford Circus Fire in 1944. Unfortunately, lessons learned in fire prevention were not learned then, nor now. In 2003, there was a Station nightclub fire in Rhode Island that killed 100 people. A permanent memorial has also already been dedicated this last May. As you heard, Tony Mara, the 15-year-old busboy who made this memorial plaque in 1992 to commemorate the 492 lost, he is no longer with us. The plaque is the only memorial that we have. Today I shared with you some of the stories of the nurses of the Coconut Grove fire. I have collected the stories of over 35 nurses, and I hope to continue. Their contributions cannot be overlooked. If anyone can connect me with any surviving nurses or their families, please contact me at my email at Salem State University. Remember, many victims survived because of the skilled nursing care that they received initially, and in the hours, days, weeks, months, and in some cases, years that followed. Please recognize that these nurses were also victims who suffered unthinkable emotional trauma in having to care for the victims of this disaster. They were truly the unsung heroines. I hope to see a permanent monument in a public area that will serve to teach the lessons of fire prevention that must be learned, and also to remember the victims, the first responders, and these unsung heroines, the nurses of the Coconut Grove. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, I want to thank Barbara for one thing. She showed graphically that little chubby kids become fat old men. But it really does. Those of us who are physicians, I think sometimes don't spend enough time thanking the nurses because they're the ones that really do it. And, some of us are off doing thinking about things and doing things and whatever, but the nurses, and especially in the era that she's talking about, the bedside nursing was the key. We have nursing now that's so complicated with computers and everything else, but that was really the era of full-scale hands-on nursing. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, and this is the administrator at the Shriners Hospital for Children, here in Boston, Eileen Skinner. The Coconut Grove Memorial Committee has entered into some negotiations with the Shriners Hospital with the prospect of developing a living memorial at Shriners, and Eileen's going to speak to that and also about the Shriners Hospital. Eileen?
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. You'll be glad to know this will be short. So I'm Eileen Skinner. I'm the administrator at the Shriners Hospital for Children in Boston. And unlike the tenure in the room, I've only been there 4 months now. And so I am also not from Boston, so this is highly educational for me. So I'm really pleased to be here today and be one of the people representing the hospital. And even though the hospital hasn't been in Boston for 75 years, as long as the event, it was the history of the hospital, as Dr. Donnellan pointed out, was highly related to the event and the discoveries and clinical work that was done later. So our hospital is now 50 years old in 2018, and as you probably know, it does many things, but its specialty is in treating burns for pediatric patients, and of course the advances of medicine and skin development and skin grafts have advanced dramatically. I'm learning a great deal since I've been there, and has allowed children who have very high degree burns, up to 90% or more of their bodies survive. And then Dr. Donnellan and others in plastic surgery help to make them look hopefully better at the end of their trauma. So the lessons learned here has had a great contribution to that history. So the reason that we're here today is Dr. Burke mentioned the tragedy of not having a memorial. The memorial committee approached us about developing what they call a living memorial. We don't know quite yet what that will be, but we're looking forward to something that is forward-looking, proactive, and would represent, of course, the tragedy of the event, the victims, but also all of the good that has come out of that tragedy and progressed into history, and I'm sure it will advance. So as I say, I'm just an ordinary mortal. I'm going to turn the podium over to Mr. Robert Baker, who is our board chair at the Shriners Hospital, and he's a real Shriner, so he's very special.
Okay. For those that you don't know, Boston Shriners Hospital is a very specialized pediatric hospital located in Boston in the West End. It's considered one of the world's preeminent hospitals for the treatment of children with severe burn injuries, complex skin conditions, and cleft lip palate. We are closely affiliated with the Massachusetts General Hospital and are the only exclusively pediatric burn center in New England. All care is provided regardless of family's ability to pay. We are able to stay true to that mission thanks to the Shriners Hospital for Children's Endowment Fund and the many people who donate through that. On behalf of Shriners Hospital for Children Boston, I want to thank the Coconut Grove Memorial Committee for organizing this event. I look forward to collaborating on ways to raise funds on behalf of pediatric burns patients and their families and to advance burns care, as well as continuing to raise awareness about the tragic night in our city's history from which so much was lost, but also which so much was learned. If we learned anything today, it's not just a person, it was a team of peoples who got together to help us go through this tragedy, as well as every other tragedy that Boston has faced. There are teams of firemen, policemen, doctors, and nurses that pulled together and helped these people survive and pushed us forward in the learning of burns. We're all here to take it to the next level, to the next step. We are going to be part of that process. And I thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. And I just wanted to point out in your program, there's a letter from us at the Shriners Hospital articulating where we think we're going to head in the future. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think Eileen knows this. The Shriners Hospital was inaugurated in 1968, and actually in 1972, I spent 6 months doing research there on a silver nitrate gel that we never quite got off the ground, but I presented a paper to the Mayo Clinic on it. So it's a pleasure to be associated with such a great institution. We only have a couple of brief things. I know brief is a word that I use euphemistically here, but it will be brief. I'm going to do a couple of readings of letters that we were asked to do. Then I'm going to introduce our two honored guests who are survivors. And then we will have Zach Graves Miller's wonderful documentary. So there really is not that much more to go. The documentary is definitely worth your viewing. Two letters. One of these letters obviously represents the ashes and the loss. The other one is much more hopeful and represents perhaps part of the phoenix. This is in memory of Beatrice Goldstein of Norfolk Street in Dorchester, age 19. Saturday, November 28th, 1942, I was 10 years old, and my sister Beatrice was 19 years old. She died that night in the Coconut Grove fire. We shared a bedroom, and I remember waking up in the middle of the night. Her bed was empty, and there was a lot of noise coming from the other room. My family was calling hospitals, trying to find out where she was. The family became more and more hysterical as time went on. There was general confusion and noise. By Sunday night, my father and a family friend, frantic with worry, went to the morgues. They had flashlights and crawled in through windows into two morgues. The bodies were lined up in rows and then went row by row until they found my sister in the second morgue. I remember most that my dad could not believe how many people were in the morgues looting bodies of money and jewelry. Another memory that haunts me, my father took me to police headquarters a week or so later, and I remembered very large cells near the lobby. One was filled almost to the top with hats, boots, pocketbooks, assorted personal property that had been found. There is, however, one blessing. I've gotten old, but every time I think of my sister, Beatrice, she is still 19. The morning of my sister's funeral, I was surprised to see 6 or 7 coffins lying on the floor in the lobby. I didn't understand the funeral homes were also overwhelmed. For years and years, I had the same dream over and over. It varied slightly, but basically was the same. The funeral home made a mistake, and during that time and all the confusion, they never really did bury my sister. She would come to me in my dream, always at night, and she would quietly come around a corner and whisper to me that she was still alive, but had experienced amnesia. Secretly, I still have Beatrice with me. Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to honor my dear sister, Beatrice. And this is from an Ann Weinberg, who lives in Falmouth and who was unable to come today. And finally, and this is a sort of an historic letter in ways, because it involves one of the figures that we all learn about in the books about the Coconut Grove, and that's about Marty Sheridan. This is from Meg Sheridan Schmidt, his daughter. My father, Martin Sheridan, a newspaperman and part-time publicist, was supposed to be at the Buddies Club with cowboy movie star Buck Jones the night of the Saturday, November 28, 1942. Instead, Buck and my father and father's wife, Connie, went to the Coconut Grove nightclub that fateful night. They arrived at 9:30 p.m. to meet a party of 25 from Monogram Pictures. They were seated in the terrace VIP section, opposite of the bank and far from the exit. Dad said the club was stuffy, smoky, dimly lit, and overcrowded. The waiters couldn't pass between the chairs and tables to serve their parties because they were so close together. As Dad finished his oyster cocktail, he first heard somebody yell, "Fight, fight!" And a moment later, someone at the end of the table screamed, "Fire!" The loud crackling of the fire sweeping through the tropical decorations in a great flash surprised my father. Dad and his wife Connie arose, took a single step, and the lights went out. That was the last time Dad saw Connie. Sadly, she died in the fire, and Dad would never forget the screams of men and women and the crash of breaking dishes and glasses. He began to choke from the toxic fumes which swept through the grove and felt himself falling slowly to the floor atop the people in front of him. This all happened in less than 1 minute. Sometime later, he regained consciousness on the floor, barely able to gasp in the terrific heat and the thick smoke. He could hear a few weak moans around him, and in the distance could be heard the blows of firefighters' axes against the windows and the splash of water from their hoses. He lay there in shock, unable to move, wondering how long he could survive. And sometime later, he heard footsteps coming toward him, and he moaned as best he could. Someone pulled him to his feet and his right arm and walked him over to the wreckage at the exit where he was propped up in a chair. His clothes were soaked. He sat there shaking, unable to see because his eyes had puffed shut from the flames. He could feel the seared flesh hanging from his hands. Finally, someone helped him into a cab and sped him to the MGH, where he would spend the next few months recovering from the burns. On November 29th, the morning edition of the Boston Globe listed Mr. and Mrs. Martin Sheridan as deceased. But the following May, Dad joined the staff of the Boston Globe. In October of 1943, Dad became a war correspondent and was aboard the USS Fremont, an attack transport ship in the Pacific, when a young officer stared at my father and asked, "Are you Marty Sheridan?" And the officer introduced himself as EMC-1 Howard Sutherland from Tiverton, Rhode Island, and added that he was the one who had pulled Mr. Sheridan from the fire. Dad was stunned beyond belief, and he kept in contact with Howard for the rest of his life. Over the years, Dad often thought that the Coconut Grove fire was the biggest story of his life. He was the only newspaperman there, but he couldn't report the story since he was part of it. For the rest of his life after the fire, he felt like he was living on borrowed time. My father would not let a major anniversary of the fire pass without writing an article or hounding the Boston media about acknowledging the anniversary of the Coconut Grove fire. He never forgot, and he never wanted Boston to forget. Thank you very much for remembering the Coconut Grove fire, my father would say. Meg Sheridan Schmidt. Finally, it is our distinct pleasure to welcome two wonderful people who are survivors of the fire and who we've had several conversations with. They have remarkable stories. One is a repeat of his visit of the street renaming and has come up from the Cape. and the other has a perfectly wonderful story to tell. So I'm going to introduce them. I think they both can get up here to the podium and use the microphone. So would you come up? Joyce Spector Meckelberg.
Okay. My one concern is whatever I was going to say, I wish I had torn up because it is completely different than what we've been hearing. But it is something that I feel is important. I've reached the point in my life where I've searched my heart, soul, and mind, trying not to open the past pages of my life that deals with pain, sorrow, or regrets. But unfortunately, I cannot. This memorial for the Cocoanut Grove has again ignited the pain. The reason I must go back in time is to set the record straight and put it to rest. Yeah. I hope I can provide some insight as to the truth of the light that went out over my head and heart that night. It is most likely that I am the only one alive that is witness. The fire that started over where Justin and I were seated was the result of a busboy who tried to replace the bulb which had gone dark and lit a match, and the rest is history. Justin Morgan was a hero who sent me off to get my coat, now in exercise in futility, and remained to help put out the fire. By the time I got up the stairs, the bodies of people trying to leave via the front door was unreal. Crawling to the back door was also unreal. But I lived, and Justin did not. It is all these years later, and only because of this memorial, that I am here today to share my thoughts. It was the simplest of acts, lighting a match to change a bulb and igniting the material that surrounded the area. It did change laws involving overcrowding, decorations. It also changed in so many different ways. I cannot put it out of my mind that when Justin and I were together that evening, the evening that he died and I didn't, because there is no way you can possibly know what is going to happen in the next 5 minutes, much less 15. And Justin had said to me, "Why don't you leave? I'll put out the fire." And of course, he didn't. He couldn't. And I lived. He didn't. So today, this group of people, I have to thank for feeling the pain that this man, who was a wonderful man, left me with tears, but also with the pain that carried me through today and made me feel as though just saying his name is enough of a tribute. And I thank you all for putting up with me and letting me say thank you to Justin, Charles Morgan, who died all those years ago. And truthfully, I really believe, except for one other person, that we were the only two people left that were alive at the time. So thank you again.
Joyce, thank you so much for your story. One thing that we had learned also from Joyce when I was talking to her a couple of times, and that is, as we mentioned at the beginning of this event, there were many military there, 51 of whom were lost in the fire. But Joyce remembers that 2 sailors pulled her out of the fire, and she has always regretted not getting their names. And so there are many stories of heroism like that. Before I introduce our other survivor, who's an old friend and who was here for the street renaming, I want to just mention that I spent 30 minutes yesterday talking to John Heyman, who is 98 years old. I believe his family, his daughter and son and their families are here today. And I spent 30 minutes on the phone once again with him, and he's remarkably lucid and sometimes very funny. And he said, "Damn it, I could do the lawn, but they won't let me." And he just didn't feel like coming. And, you know, at 98, you can certainly tell the world what to do. I had a wonderful conversation with him. And the interesting thing about him from the medical viewpoint was he was admitted to the Boston City and then transferred to the General. And the great Dr. Kazanjian, who is one of my heroes, operated on him 6 times on his hands and his ears. His hands look fantastic. He showed me them previously. So again, a salute to John Heyman, who's 98 now and very, very with the program, written up with a huge article about 5 years ago in the Springfield newspaper. And so we get to our second of our survivors, Marshall Cole, who is up from the Cape. And Marshall spoke at the street renaming and has a unique story, too, about the Coconut Grove fire. Marshall?
I got up here, I hope I can get down. Pretty tough for an old tap dancer. And to be a tap dancer in South Boston, that's something else, believe me. Woo! I caught hell when I was a young one, believe me. Tap dancers are very scarce in Southie, I can tell you. And many a fight I got into, by the way. You have to fight for your life. Some of the girls thought I was cute, but the boys didn't like it at all, the boyfriends. Not at all. Well, anyhow, how I got to be a tap dancer really goes way back. I was 12 years old. My uncle Steve Flynn was a ballroom dancer, a professional ballroom dancer. Well, I had a lot of rhythm in me, and I guess they saw a possibility. But anyway, I liked to dance. They taught me Irish and step dancing, jigs and reels. Terry O'Toole had me on his program. A lot of you people in here will know who the heck is Terry O'Toole. But he was an old Irishman that had an Irish program, and it was all Gaelic, and it was music, mostly jigs and music they'd play, you know. Well, anyhow, I danced for him. But best for me, I guess, was the fact that I used to get on bar tops. That's quite a thing. And I'd be doing my jigs and reels for the boys that would tip it a few. And of course, I'd get nickels and dimes. Boy, I was a rich boy at that day. At 12 years old, I thought that was great. Get money like that for doing what I like to do, I think that's the job for me. So anyhow, I get taught professionally by Stanley Brown Studios. I don't know if he's still around or whatever. But he taught me how to dance. And I guess I learned pretty well because I did professionally. I did circus. I hit nightclubs or different states. But anyhow, make a long story short, I hope you brought a lunch. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm only kidding. So anyhow, we were down in Singac, New Jersey, and evidently I got too friendly with a hat check girl, and my partner didn't like that at all, and we broke up. So I wound up back home in Boston without a job and no money, and so I heard the rumor in the circuit that they were looking for some males for the nightclub, a dancer. So I said, hey, that's for me, I guess. So I applied for it. And the choreographer was there at the nightclub, and he said, get up on the stage and show me what you can do. Well, of course, I banged it out in great shape. He says, you're hired. So that was my career in the Coconut Grove. It could have been my last, too. But it turns out that the night of the fire, I'll go on that one. I wound up in the dressing room because the club was just jammed full of people, shoulder to shoulder. The place was really going. And I usually hung out, excuse the expression, down at the Melody Lounge because it was nice and quiet. They had a little bar in there, nice people. They had a woman playing a piano, singing away, having a grand time. And of course, that was a great place for me. Between shows, we had an afternoon show or an early show, and then we had a late show. So I had to kill some time. So I couldn't go there. I didn't want to go there to be too darn crowded. So I wound up staying in the dressing room. So I'm in the and bear in mind, I'm only 16 years old. And I tell you, I have a lot of energy, but so you kind of rested. I sat on it, and I had a little bunk in there where I kind of stretched out, taking it in. It was beautiful. And I heard this rumbling sound. What the? Sound like a train going. Being a kid, I say, I got to find out what's going on here. So, of course, I open up the dressing room door, and there's this pair of stairs that led up to the second floor, which is where I was. And I noticed there was a service entrance down there, and people were jamming, trying to get out there like crazy. And I'd say, what's going on down there? Must be a rumble of some sort. Hey, I'll get my shoes. I'll go down and get in on this one. Then there was a big cloud of smoke and sparks coming up at me. I said, this is no rumble. And I say, I better get back into the room here. So I get in, close the door behind me, and I had a nice camel hair coat. That was the thing. If you had a camel hair coat, you had it. You were it. So I had my camel hair coat. I said, I'm going to take this. I knew the roof was the only place to go. Excuse this. I'm breaking this place up slowly. I'm sorry. But the camel hair coat I got, I had a pair of tap shoes that were just perfect. I had them toned in beautiful. They made music by themselves. So I had to have them. And I had a tuxedo. So I had all this stuff gathered up to me, and I was going through the roof to get outside. That's where I was going to go to get up. I hoped I could get out over the roof. When all of a sudden the door in the dressing room opened up, and this guy kept going through like a crazy man. And he ran through the room, put his hands over and went through the window. Oh, when I seen that, camel hair coat, down you went, tuxedo, down you went, shoes you went. I'm going after him. What he seen down there, I don't want to see. That's where I was headed. So I'll tell you, boy, for a couple of moments there, it was pretty shaky. I hated to give up the shoes. I figured I could stuff them in my pockets or something, but get out of here. So I did. So I went through the room. then 8 chorus girls behind me and a bunch of other people. So I'm up on the roof. I'm the leader. Follow Peter Piper, whatever. So I have nowhere, I don't know where I'm going on the roof. It's black as ink, and I can see flames and smoke coming out from some of the windows down below. And I said, boy, I don't want to be on this place, not up here, because it's a tarred roof. In those days, they used to waterproof the roof with tar. Well, if that ever caught on fire, it wouldn't take long to have, there'd be a roasted marshal, I know for sure. So I said, we got to get out of here. So somebody found a 15-foot step ladder, which of course is far from the top of the roof. So we got up there. We had to get the chorus girls down because they weren't dressed for spring. So the girls, we had to hold the top of the step ladder. So I had one side, the other fellow had the other side. And we had the step ladder so the girls could go down. So they go down as far as they could go to the bottom run. And there was always some happy men down there to catch the chorus girls, you know. I mean, there's always something going for somebody. But as the story goes, we got the girls down. And then we said, who's going to hold the ladder for us? We're still up on the roof until we saw God Love the Fire Department. Well, it was like the Marines landing at the beach. They come down with a big ladder, took us all for a ride. This thing's getting in the way, or maybe I'm getting in the way. I'm not sure which. But no, it was just something up there in the room. Well, meanwhile, I didn't realize that they all thought I knew where I was going, and I wasn't about to tell them anything different. So finally, what we did is we got down finally. There was a little restaurant or a snack bar or whatever it was, a bar anyhow. And all the chorus girls were all bunched up in there. And what saved the night, one of the chorus girls coming through the dressing room picked up my camel hair coat. And she said, Marshall, I've got your coat. Oh. Of course, I didn't realize all these lives were being lost. I mean, I just thought I was the luckiest guy in the world. And I almost felt like saying, you didn't get my tap shoes, did you? No, they got the camel hair coat. But while I was there, of course, the reporters were all over the place. And one of the chorus girls says, he saved my life. Who, me? Because they had followed me. They thought I was helping them out. But I didn't save them intentionally. They just happened to be around with me. That was it. So it turned out to be nice at that point in time. The greatest thing I ever did, and the smartest thing I ever did, at about 16 years old, we don't think the way you do now, when you're in your 20s or whatever. And of course, I thought these chorus girls were all old ladies. They were 20, 25. I thought they were old ladies. I was going with a girl 16, and that was my girl. And she said, how would you, they said, you're with all these beautiful chorus girls. I said, but they're all old ladies, To me, they were. And they were all taller than me almost. Of course, long-legged, chorus girls aren't short-legged. They're usually pretty tall. So that put me at a disadvantage somewhat, but whatever. So I survived that one by calling my parents. And they heard through the radio and people trying to get a hold of them that the big fire, and of course, calling them, that was the biggest thing I ever did. The smartest thing I ever did. That was the only smart thing I've ever done, was to call my parents. From here on out, whenever I go to a place, I look for an exit. Boy, if you can't understand what fear can be when all of a sudden you realize something big is happening and you could be hurt. That, I don't care how bright you are, you're going to be in a panic. So if pick an exit or pick an alternate exit, because if one exit jams up, you might have a second one. But keep that in mind. When you go somewhere, just give your eyeballs a little shot around where I am. Respect it, like movie theaters. If you ever go to a movie theater, make darn well sure you know where the exits are. And sometimes one exit might be jammed with people, and you can't use that one, you'll have to use another one. Don't stand in line, you haven't got the time. So that's all I can say. Is just keep alert, and that helps, because I experienced what fear can be. At 16, it still sticks in my mind. And the only scare I ever get back to remind me of the Coconut Grove was in the Navy, was on the carrier Hancock. And we had a kamikaze attack, and they had a lot of boys get killed. And anyhow, to make a long story short, I also have a blood phobia, my blood especially. I can't change Band-Aids without wanting to go down on my knees. I would say, hey, I'll be no doctor for sure. But anyhow, I thought I was shaking that because there was a lot of stuff going on that probably took my mind off it. And there was a little boy that got burnt. He was an Airedale, they call him, on the decks. And he got burned severely. It brought some shrapnel. So I went down to help with them where they had the boys. But the poor guy, I went down to look at him. I never saw what burns look like. Wow, you can't see it. The skin is all colors, red, pussy, and of course he had shrapnel through him, and he was dying of thirst. And I was going to give him a glass of water. The corpsman said, no. So I had to get a glass of water with a piece of cotton bat and stick it in his mouth. Take the, excuse me, it's okay. I apologize. That reminded me of the Coconut Grove.
I'm all set now. I'm sorry
Yes. A sizable number of people here have direct connections to the fire, not just our two wonderful survivors. And we're going to just have an opportunity to give a one-liner as to who you are and what your connection is with a mobile mic. So we have people that have a mobile mic. If you want to stand up and identify yourself and just give a one-liner as to what your connection is. And then we'll have the wonderful documentary that Zach has made. So,
thank you. This is a wonderful presentation. My name's Tom Gibson. My mother was Helen Hollander. She was a survivor. She was at a Melody Lounge at the time the fire broke out. She was one of the 39 that were taken to the Mass General Hospital and one of the 32 that survived, luckily for me. Thank you.
we have somebody else? Up back, way back there? Is Dr. Spar here? Yeah, I want Dr. Spar to say a word when he gets a chance.
Hello, my name is Ted McCarthy. Ken, I want to thank you for all the work you put into this great affair. My parents were both at the fire. I was 3 months old. Both of them lost their lives.
Mike, can you bring a mic around to Dr. Spar, too?
I have one here. Hi, my name is Dr. Stephen Spar. When I was a house officer at Boston City in the 1980s, I did historical research on this event, and I had the pleasure of meeting two of the survivors, James and Helen Coughlin. They had both been trapped in the fire and were pulled out at the last moment by the fire department. She developed a very unusual neurological disorder called visual agnosia, the first time anyone in the United States had ever developed that as a result of the fire. And he developed what today we would call PTSD. And the one that described that was a woman named Alexandra Adler, a doctor who had escaped from Austria because the Nazis had taken over. She was the daughter of Alfred Adler, and I got to meet her as well. And the punchline of this joke, and it's not a joke, but the punchline of this story is these two women were both in their 20s when they met, and they remained lifelong friends, and they died within months of each other in 2001.
Steve did not mention that he, in the 1980s, when he was at the Boston City Hospital, first in internal medicine, then in neurology, assembled a panel of all of the major surgeons and physicians who dealt with the Coconut Grove fire. And he's currently hunting, I think, for the tape. It included Max Finland and Oliver Cope, and he can tell you who it was, but it's all the major physicians that you saw listed by Matt and by Peter. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to speak also. I'm Barbara Roberts Miller, and my grandparents, Pauline Rifkin and Herman Rifkin, were in the fire. My grandfather had the party for Monogram Pictures that Buck Jones was at and was died. And my grandmother died, I think, from the asphyxiation also, because she was killed by the smoke. And my grandfather was very sick for a couple of years, and I'm not sure which hospital he was in. We were just talking about it. Now we have to find out somehow. But he lived until my son was 10 months old. So he was great afterwards. But and my brother talked to Zach Miller about the situation a little bit for the film.
We have two families that are here that have each lost about 3 members of their family, the O'Neill family and the Slate family. And the O'Neills have a foundation actually at the shrine, and Jerry Slate is a friend of mine. He's the grandson of a survivor, but his grandmother perished. And if they want to say a couple of words or whatever. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jerome Slate, a friend of Ken Marshall's. My grandmother and her sister died at the Coconut Grove fire. My grandfather, Ethel Slate, my grandfather, Jacob Slate, survived and was hospitalized for about 3 months at Boston City Hospital. We strongly suspect that Ken Marshall's mother took care of my grandfather. And he's mentioned in Paul Bensquin's book, The Holocaust.
Hi, my name is Richard Levinson. My uncle, Dr. Stanley Levinson, was one of the doctors at the Boston City Hospital that treated the patients from the fire.
My name is James Hanson Prince. I'm the artistic director of the Core Theater out of Richardson, Texas. My wife's great uncle died in the fire, and folklore through the family. So we actually wrote a play about it called Inferno, Fire at the Coconut Grove, that we ran at the Boston Center for the Arts in the beginning of 2016. And we are planning to take that to New York. So if you want to know more about that, thecoretheater.org.
I'm Joan Heyman-Yogg, and I'm here with my husband and my brother, and it is our father that you've made reference to, John Heyman, who I guess is the oldest survivor right now. He's at home and just felt as though the memories of this event were a little too much to come back and share at this moment. But he also witnessed the lighting of that match, which he has described to us for our entire lives, of seeing that match lit and all of the decorations on the ceiling of the Melody Lounge immediately go up into flames. He was one of the lucky ones. The young woman that he was with, unfortunately, did not live. And he was due to go into the service on that Monday. And of course, spent the next few months at Mass General Hospital instead. So.
I'm not a survivor. I'm not a relative of a survivor, but I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everybody here, if you see locked doors, exit doors, you leave, you call the fire department. Because all the laws in the world aren't going to do any good unless people enforce them. And enforcement in general depends on you. If you see a fire hazard, get out, call the fire department. They will be grateful.
Yep. Paul Christian makes the point, which is a very interesting point, and he taught me, that people, when they enter a building, seem in their brain to remember the way they came in, and when the disaster happens, they retrace their steps, which is usually a fatal move because very often that involves the one exit that they can't get out. So you should always have that alternate way to get out. As we're all taught now when we go to movie theaters, there's always the second and third exits that are available. And the ones that really survived at the Coconut Grove basically survived with alternate ways out, not through the circular door. And by the way, we lost another survivor this past Monday, a lady named Chloe Webster, who allegedly was the last person out of the revolving door. And she turned around and saw that nobody else got out. And of course the revolving door was a real problem because there were no adjacent doors that opened
out. My name is James Fox. Ken previously mentioned that I had two cousins, whom I didn't know, of course, who died in the fire, one in the fire and 1 month later. But I wanted to say something else. As a criminologist, I have studied this because of its significance in terms of the indictments and in particular the conviction against the owner of the club. I give a walking tour of crime spots of Boston, the Unfreedom Trail, as well as a duck tour that focuses on crime spots in Boston. And what's fascinating to me is that given the significance of this event in the history of Boston, that I would say a majority of Bostonians, including legislators, have no clue as to where it occurred. You ask them where was the Coconut Grove, they think it's somewhere in Back Bay. And that's what's so shameful about the fact that we don't have a memorial at the location. Thank you.
Professor Fox, by the way, is a member of our committee.
I just wanted to say one thing. First, I apologize for my voice. I am Donna White. I'm the president of the Boston City Hospital School of Nursing, and I'm here to represent the nurses. We grew up as nurses when we entered at 17 years old, so you saw teenagers caring for the sickest of the sick. We grew up as nurses learning about this. We grew up learning how the rule of 9, how to take care of people with burns, because the older nurses who had lived through this taught us. So I am extremely grateful to Barbara for what she's done. And I also want to tell you that my father was a submariner and talked about the Coconut Grove all the time and always said it could have been him. And honestly, anyone at that age could have been anyone because it was so well known. But I just really wanted to speak for the voice of nursing and the Boston City Hospital. The general was our enemy, but that's okay. They did as good as work as we did. Thank you all.
Thank you. Can we have maybe have just one more?
All right. Can Chris O'Neill from New Bedford, the Thomas and Catherine O'Neill Charitable Foundation, thank you to your committee, to Paul and Mike, and all the work that you've done.
Okay. Because of timing elements, and we've gone on a long time, I'm going to ask the Reverend to lead us in a closing prayer, but we're going to have the documentary that Zach has done afterwards. And the other thing is I invite you, if you want to see the plaque, it's directly outside these double doors underneath the street sign. So you're more than welcome to go visit that after the proceedings. Reverend?
All right, can we just bow our heads? God, we thank you for this day, this memorial celebration, those who lost life. We continue to pray for the souls of the departed and those survivors who are here, those represented here today. God, continue to bless us with good health, strength, and life, and laughter. And we pray, oh God, that the Lord would continue to bless all of us in all aspects of our lives. So may the Lord bless you and keep you, and may his face smile upon you and give you his peace. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.
Thank you very much, Reverend. Just a closing comment before we see Zach's film, which is really quite something. 4 years of very hard work. If you haven't registered at the desk and you want to be on our mailing list and database, I really urge you to make sure that Barbara, my former office manager, is running the desk, has your information in the books. Number 2, there are Coconut Grove 75th anniversary memorial pins, which some of you know about, which we're just charging a nominal fee for, and they're available at the desk as well. And I just want to announce that we have arranged, and this happened serendipitously when I was sitting at a table down the Cape, and just the next guy sitting next to me with his bride was somebody who works for one of the Attleboro companies, and he is the one that makes challenge coins for even the White House and whatever. So we're having a very beautiful, which Paul Christian helped to design, challenge coin that will be available after the first of the year, and we'll be happy to make you aware of that if you'd like to purchase that, again, for a nominal fee. And so we're going to turn the proceedings over to Zach Miller, Graves Miller, and we'll see the documentary. I have seen it, and it is a remarkable collection of interviews and really a nice summary of a lot of things. Is Zach? One last thing. After the documentary, the hotel is, again, very kindly going to provide coffee and goodies, and best of all is a cash bar available on the other side of the hallway.
All right, I'm really going to make this short, I promise. I just want to thank everybody for showing up today. Spent 4 years on this project, and this is really the audience I made this for, all of you guys. You know, this film is a short film that I made for the 75th, and in the next month we're going to be shooting and editing for a feature film. So I hope you enjoy it. It was made for 492 people who had died at the Coconut Grove, the survivors, and everybody who has been touched by this event. And all of you can actually help by sharing, if you go on Facebook or our website, sharing this with the city of Boston and getting the word out. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the movie.
I was lucky that somehow someone upstairs was guiding me to that door. But being pulled out of that door and seeing those bodies, I can still see them. I can still see them.
Stairwell was all in flame. There were people that squeezed in there. We finally reached the lobby. People were trying to get out the revolving door, but it was stuck. When we went through, we looked back and no one else came behind us.
When the fire started, it happened so fast. Apparently people just rushed to get out where they came in. Basically, where would you go? You go out where you came in.
You're pushing, right? Somebody else is pushing. They're nervous, they're scared. The door gets stuck.
People were killed by the conditions of the club that prevented them from getting out. That was a real tragedy in this whole event. A gentleman named Charles Solomon ruled the Coconut Grove. He was Hollywood gangster, the Capone, if you will, of Boston. He was known to hang out at the Coconut Grove. He would hold court there. He was well known to both the authorities, to the newspapers, and he made the Coconut Grove kind of his showpiece. It didn't matter to him whether it made money, it was just his showpiece. He was the gangster who had his hand in a lot of different activities in the city, particularly in bootlegging. And he worried about people running out on their bills. So The doors of the club were kept locked. And the Coconut Grove was a very elite, posh club. I mean, there was nothing like it in the area. The Latin Quarter was around the corner, and that opened up later. But the Coconut Grove was well known across the country.
The decor was just beautiful in that club. When you walked in, there was palm trees all around the left, and then there was the stage that had draperies going over the top, right off of the stage, velour and blue. It was positively beautiful. Then the bar had curtains. I told you that they pulled down and they were all lavender and everything. They looked beautiful. I just enjoyed working there. $7 a week union scale pay. That was paid for all waiters in Massachusetts at that time. But we were making $10 to $15 a night in tips. I was single. I was giving my mother $15 a week, and I was living good. You know, I went and bought suits and everything. And it was a great place. I loved the Coconut Grove.
Bay Village had morphed from, at the turn of the century, a church area. It then turned into a film storage area. There was a syndicate from Brookline and Newton that owned all of the film rights, and they stored the film in the Bay Village area.
That was the entertainment district.
This is where all the movies were collected and distributed to the movie theaters.
All the theater supply houses were there. I remember my father, he was friendly with Joe Levine, Joseph E. Levine, and he was friendly with a lot of other people. The people that owned the Mayfair across the street, as well as Lou Walters, who owned the Latin Quarter. So there were 3 nightclubs in that area.
By the time I was familiar with that area, 1920s and 30s, my father and my grandfather had an office on Church Street, 39 Church Street, which was Boston's Film Row, they called it. Columbia, Fox, Universal, United Artists, all lined up along that street. And that's where most of the film distribution came from at that time. Their office was there primarily to service the business, which was motion picture exhibition rather than distribution.
I used to go with my dad, usually on the weekend. He'd take me with him. And I enjoyed that. Those were great times.
Today we think of nightclubs kind of in a different light, but that time there was no television, so people went out at night. And a lot of them would end up at the Coconut Grove, and that was a very prominent place. I mean, if you look at who was at the Coconut Grove, you'll see soldiers, sailors, dates, people on dates, people celebrating weddings, people celebrating anniversaries, old and young. So it was kind of a melding pot of different people coming out to clubs. The Coconut Grove really started out as a concept, an idea by 2 gentlemen, Mickey Alpert and Jacques Renard, who was well known as a performer and as a band leader. Mickey Alpert was actually a furniture salesman, but he wanted to be an impresario. He wanted to be an entertainer.
They knew that their dreams were to be in the entertainment business. Of their frustration of always working for someone, they wanted to work for themselves. They found a warehouse on Piedmont Street that they thought that they could redevelop into a nightclub. They had a friend of theirs who was an interior designer. Jack Barnett continued to fund the operation, and they built a brand new nightclub.
He was someone who promised to give them a lot of money for the club. The only thing was Berman turned out to be a con man who kind of disappeared on them and left them holding the bag.
And he was on the run from the FBI and everyone else. Jack Bennett or Barnett, he had 2 different names.
I've seen the menu for the opening night, very elegant. They had a maitre d' who knew his way around a table.
The one that really was sort of the one everybody wanted to go to was the Coconut Grove, because it was the jewel. And it had this South Sea atmosphere, a retractable roof